Maybe I should. Good afternoon, good evening, and in some cases, good morning. Belated Happy New Year to you all. I'm David Isaac, I like to think, still relatively new Provost. I'm just entering my 4th term as we begin first week of Hillary term 2023. And I'm very pleased to welcome you to this year's first Worcester online lecture for old members. And the very good news is that we have old members joining us from all over the world, and we're delighted that you've been able to join us. Just to put my presence in context, I'm speaking to you from the lodgings in Worcester. It's -1 in Oxford. The gardens and grounds at Worcester look as amazing as ever, particularly as the lake is nearly frozen over. The snowdrops and aconites are out, and there's a very heavy frost. So many of you, I hope, will remember being in Worcester at the start of Hillary term and remembering the college being as beautiful as it ever can be at the beginning of a very cold spring. I'm especially delighted to welcome today's speaker, Patricia Clavin, who's our Professor of Modern History here at Worcester. Patricia's work focuses on regional and global organizations, food and capitalism. And as you perhaps know, she's written extensively on the history of the Great Depression, particularly in Europe. She has also written on the failure of economic diplomacy, particularly in Britain, France, and the US, and her book focused on those 3 countries between 1931 and 36. And she's also worked with our late Provost, Provost Asa Briggs, on the history of modern Europe since 1950. And Patricia, not only in addition to being a professor here at Oxford, is a fellow of the British Academy and a foreign member of the Norwegian Academy of Science and Letters. And tonight, certainly tonight in the UK, Patricia is going to talk on turbulence and human security between 1900 and 1950. So I'm very excited to be about to hear what Patricia has to say. From a sneak preview, I know that she's going to be covering a wide range of themes that are very familiar to all of us: geopolitical turbulence, financial crises, and epidemics, and the importance of international cooperation in resolving some of those very significant challenges that we continue, I think, to live through. Patricia's going to be talking for between 40 to 45 minutes. And just by way of housekeeping, I am really keen that Patricia is able to finish her presentation. Please put your questions in the Q&A, and we will then have time after Patricia's presentation to take questions and observations on her talk. So without more ado, actually, I've forgotten one thing. We are going to be recording, as I think you all know, this lecture. So that gives us an opportunity to share Patricia's wisdom with a number of old members who were keen to be with us today, but couldn't make it. So I hope you won't object. Your mere presence and continuation, and I speak as a lawyer, is deemed consent, but I was really keen to flag that to you. So now, without more ado, I'm going to hand over to Patricia. Turbulence and Human Security, 1900 to 1950. Patricia.
Many thanks, David. Yeah, the dates are a little approximate, but I didn't want to make it sound as if I was going to talk about the whole of the 20th century in about 40 minutes or so. So yes, it's a great pleasure to be with everyone. I have a little bit of a cold, so it's the extra virtue of an online presentation that though you're sharing some of my research and my ideas, you won't be sharing my bugs, for which I'm sure you're very grateful. I'm also speaking to you from my beautiful office in Worcester. I hope I'm illuminated enough. Well, it's gorgeous when the light floods in, but I'm very conscious at exactly the twilight hour here. It becomes a little dark, so I hope I'm visible. I want to talk for a little while before I start sharing my slides, some of which contain images from my research, which is why I was keen to share them. Like David, I'm relatively new here. This is also my 4th term. I'm very grateful to everyone in the college here for making me feel so welcome. And the talk tonight, in many respects, draws together some of my past interests as well as my current and what will be my future research preoccupations, really around the history of food, human security and global order. So as David said, I'm a historian who works on modern Europe, that includes Britain, in a global context. And so I don't have a sort of specific country interest, but rather I'm more interested in the way that the local, the national and the international interact with one another. And I have a new project with some research colleagues here in Oxford, in the Oxford Martin School. So it has an explicit future orientation entitled Changing Global Orders and Managing Future Shocks. My talk is really historical, but as David's already suggested, it has some powerful resonances to the modern day, I think. One of the things that's been rather disturbing for me in some respects is the way that the world I live in looks more and more like the world that I study. So the title of the talk is Turbulence and Human Security. Before I get to the turbulent part, let me say a little bit about human security. What does it mean? In 2004, the United Nations published a widely cited report entitled Human Security Now. It was a landmark undertaking for the organization, and it was also distributed across all the other UN bodies and organizations. The Human Security Report underlined the widening notion of security since the end of the Cold War. So it was a way of rethinking what was security after the Cold War had ended. And the report underlined the importance of economic, social, political, and environmental concerns. So it really opened up the way that, sought to open up the way that we should think about security. At the time, the concept of human security was presented as entirely new, entirely novel, and it was centered on 2 key ideas. The first idea is that the elements of security need to be broadly defined and that they're interconnected. So for the UN, the core constituents of security were income, food, health, the environment, identity, so people's protected characteristics, and political freedom. So as a result, for example, the concept of human security underlines how economic crises precipitate migration flows that in turn imperil environments, or how war and its aftermath can disrupt agricultural production, the distribution of food, resulting in health, hunger, and malnutrition, which then leads to the spread of disease. In fact, some of the kind of interactions we can see on the ground happening in Ukraine at the moment. The second key idea that human security sought to evoke is what the UN called a bottom-up approach. So this concept of security was not centered on states, it was centered on people. And it was intended to recognize a wide range of actors that were important and were part of the conceptualization of security and the prevalence of conflict within as much as between countries. After the report was published in 2004, the concept of human security made a really big impact on academic research and on practice. It made a big impact in the field of international relations, security studies, war studies, anthropology, sociology, gender studies, feminist critics of security, and so on. So in universities, it had a big impact. It also began to shape planning in national, regional, and global institutions. So aside from the UN organizations, things like the Food and Agricultural Organization, the World Health Organization, and so on, it also shaped security thinking in ASEAN, the EU, the British Army. They all adopted human security as an operational framework. So too did NATO. And they were really beginning to anticipate that climate and conflict change and conflict over scarce resources, so conflict over water, over food, was likely to be the future cause of conflict. So that was the world in the 2010s. But at the same time, the geopolitical cogs of our world were also beginning to change. So this is not so much about human security. The changing political landscape in China, Russia, and the United States in more recent times, in the last 5 or 6 years, has also illustrated that major power conflict is back, what's sometimes called geopolitics. So something that's seen as rather different to human security. It's a top-down version of security. And the war in Ukraine, above all, illustrates the return of war as an instrument of state policy, something that was a big preoccupation of international relations in the 1920s and 30s, but had receded as a concern in the 21st century until very recently. And so all of these more recent developments have also reasserted a more traditional meaning of security, which is classically understood to mean the control and use of military force, something that human security sought to challenge. And at the same time, of course, some of the institutions like the UN have seemed to be marginalized or under attack in this present crisis. So in this lecture, one of the things that I want to do is to argue that the bottom-up approach of human security and the top-down approach of geopolitics are not dichotomous. It's not one or the other. One of the challenges of understanding our turbulent times is recognizing that there's an interplay between this top-down and bottom-up approach to security. And part of the way that we understand this challenge in the 21st century is that our world is more interconnected than ever before. This is one of the things that I've noticed a lot of commentators say about the challenges of understanding the world in the 21st century. We seem so more interconnected than ever before. In fact, this is not the way that other societies would, well, what I want to say is other societies have perceived themselves as going through exactly the same sort of thing. In exactly 100 years ago, so in the 1920s, international society was perceived as going through exactly the same type of challenge, that the world was more interconnected than ever before. And it had to deal with a series of unexpected crises or blows that they sought to make sense of during and after the First World War. I'm trying to challenge the way that we think, or the historians have thought about war and peace in the past in my lecture and in my research. For much of the 20th century, historians tended to describe periods of time as periods of crisis, like the 1920s or the 1930s, or the years between, and periods of stability. So the 1920s and 30s were always contrasted in European history, particularly with the period of 1945 to 1990, which, though there was a Cold War going on, was also seen as an era of great stability in European relations because there was no major war in Europe in that period. War now, of course, is back. And it meant that historians tended to think about the history of the 20th century as a whole as organized around 2 world wars. That's how they kind of structured the big narratives. And if I can now bring up my presentation, let me see if I can get this to work. See, you can see this. Of course, there's no way of telling whether you can see it, but hopefully you can. Okay, so let me go to the next slide. So for historians who thought about organizing the history of the 20th century around war and peace, it tended to be that the years up until 1939 were all about the origins of the Second World War. The years after were all about the origins of the Cold War. And really people thought about peace most intensively in the aftermath of war. What I want to argue is really that war and peace are not absolutes. They actually are present almost all of the time. Another key moment in the history of international relations and international society was a kind of emerging confidence throughout the period after 1945 until around 2003 as to the value of international coordination and cooperation enshrined through regional and international institutions. It's captured here in this quote by John Ruggie, very famous American international relations theorist, who argued that political order has emerged that's capable of handling at least some collective tasks in an ex-ante coordinated manner. What he meant was that international organizations and regional organizations, the EU, ASEAN, the IMF, the World Bank, anticipated problems and began to plan for them, which made the world more stable, much safer. That kind of confidence in the purpose of these institutions and their value has largely evaporated in the last few years. What I want to do now is really return to history to see how war and peace were thought about actually at the time, and to enable us to think a little bit more creatively about their place in the history of the 1900s, from 1900 to 1950, and how that might help us understand the turbulent times that we're also living through today. Rather than think about the first half of the 20th century as leading automatically just to the Second World War, to kind of chart it as a history of failure, more recently, scholars, historians, and I'm one of them, have really tried to show how in the 1920s and 1930s, there were major advances, positive developments in the theories and practices of international relations that helped certainly Europe become more stable after 1945. And part of that project has been to reevaluate the role of international organizations and international law, much of which was founded in the aftermath of the First World War. The 1920s in particular was redolent with calls from across the ideological spectrum for international coordination and international cooperation. People on the right argued, I mean, on the extreme right, sought to promote a version of global order that was also about international coordination and cooperation amongst authoritarian powers, in the same way that one might argue that's happening at the moment as a kind of alternative version of what Putin would like as the outcome of the war in Ukraine. I want to sort of show how it is possible also to have cooperation in times of conflict, which is, I hope, a kind of positive thing to argue, and to say something about the relationship between human security and the origins of war, notably in relation to the origins of the Second World War. And to do that in a little bit more detail, in the second part of my talk, I'm going to spend a bit of time looking at the effects of shocks that hit the territories of the former Austro-Hungarian Empire in the first years after the First World War, and how that shaped the international order dominated largely by Britain and its wartime allies. The first part of the lecture, to which I now turn, explores the core features of the New World Order intended to sort of frame human security after the First World War. And the second part gives a brief account also of the importance of food and hunger, showing how crisis built capacity in international organizations. It was a period of unruly problems that interacted in dynamic ways, producing paradoxical outcomes, some which were good, some which were less positive. And as a result, it created separate and competing narratives as to the value and purpose of cooperation. So one of the things that faces us as a real challenge in the 21st century is, on the one hand, there's a lot of talk and a lot of stress, as there was in the 1920s, about the importance and value of cooperation, but there's no real discussion about what cooperation is, what it should comprise, and that's really the challenge. And so first, let me turn to the basis on which cooperation was determined. One of the things that was really novel was the insertion of public opinion into international relations in the 1920s. When the International Institute for International Affairs, the Royal Institute for International Affairs, forgive me, also called Chatham House, was set up in 1920, its founding charter articulated its commitment to helping Britain and its allies develop what they called sustainable security. The Institute was part of a wider movement determined to increase states' accountability in foreign policy. At the same time, there was a move to try and help society understand foreign policy, to bring them on board to what it was, and have more of a say in it than they had in the past. This, of course, was born from the fact that consent wasn't sought in many countries to fight the First World War. Societies were just conscripted. They weren't asked whether they, were prepared to support the war in certainly most of the European powers. So the creation of Chatham House happened in Paris. You can see here on the slide, the discussions were held at the Hotel Majestic in Paris at the same time as the Paris Peace Conference was being held in and around the buildings of the Versailles Palace. And it was a joint Anglo-American effort. It was what Chatham House should do was discussed in the same framework as the US Council of Foreign Relations, which body was also supposed to have the same function, promoting expertise to advise governments and also to educate the public. And it came alongside the emergence of new chairs in international relations across Europe. The establishment of the PPE degree here in Oxford was also part of that move. And there were also international summer schools and the Graduate Institute in Geneva, which hosted them. So what I'm trying to suggest is there's a wider network of education for informed and interested publics around international affairs in this moment, which was all tied in to the idea of expanding, exchanging, educating public opinion. This was not a straightforward proposal. This was deeply controversial, even in democracies. In Britain, there were fears about the role of journalists. One senior British Foreign Office official in Paris called journalists busybodies, and were worried about the hold of journalists over public opinion. Politicians and advisors were also worried that the open discussion of foreign policy might inadvertently lead them to leak official secrets. This is the kind of thing that they discussed in the documents around proposals for Chatham House. But a more democratically accountable foreign policy was inevitable. It was the outcome of both political bargains made to sustain the unprecedented war effort after 1914 and the collapse of empires where consent for the war had not been sought. One of the real drivers in this kind of debate were countries like Australia and New Zealand, whose consent had not been sought, but had played a major part. That was a kind of core underlying dynamic in some intra-imperial relations. The other part of this, of course, is that democratic politics in Europe expanded markedly as a result of the collapse of the German, Russian, Austrian and Ottoman empires, as well as moves to franchise women and younger age groups across the continent. It's a huge part of this dynamic. Women and young people are hugely engaged in these international projects of international exchange. So in short, the prosecution of war and its subsequent outcomes changed both the composition of states and states' relationships to society nationally and internationally. At the same time, the discussions at the Paris Peace Conference, Lloyd George, Woodrow Wilson, Orlando, Clemenceau, the debate around making Germany squeeze until the pips squeak, made officials acutely aware of the challenges that engaging the public opposed to international relations. In 1919, a British official, Lionel Curtis, put the problems like this. The settlements being made in Paris were mainly the resultant of the public opinion of the various countries concerned, which public opinions were often in conflict. This was really particularly what he really had in mind, was especially the issue over German reparations and how much Germany could really afford to pay for the full consequences of the cost of the war. It was not something that was really on the agenda at the start of the Paris Peace Conference, but as the discussions went on, it became a huge issue for reasons I won't go into here, but I'm very happy to discuss in questions, which unnerved people like Curtis, because they were worried whether Germany could pay, and whether Germany, there's a kind of financial question and also a political question. Did Germany have the will to pay, or was this going to be the door that allowed the Bolsheviks to come to power? Because of course the Russian Revolution and the Russian Civil War is also by now in full blown force. Curtis took the classic view of the expert, that right public opinion, in his mind, right public opinion was mainly produced by a small number of people in real contact with the facts, the people who really understood the facts, and who had thought through the issues involved. Curtis and people like him, who's in the Foreign Office, the Colonial Foreign Office, stressed the importance of experts. He imagined these men, in his mind, they were all men, would help the public's view on foreign policy cohere. In the future, these officials and specialists would constitute the most valuable factor in what he considered sound opinion. So in the midst of this kind of states and public opinion emerges the role of the expert. The expert would be critical, and the expert certainly takes on real importance, as I hope to demonstrate. His second key point was that neither foreign policy nor public opinion should be guided by the calculation of narrow or individual interest. Rather, interest needed to be broadly conceived. For in his words, it was the advancement of that universal interest, that the particular interest of several nations would be found. Curtis's perspective reflected a commonplace view amongst the former wartime allies and associated powers, so Britain, France, and the United States. On the one hand, democratization of foreign policy was to be welcomed. On the other, the plurality of global voices, the plurality of voices globally, forgive me, the plurality of voices globally needed to be controlled for the sake of Western national and imperial voices. So while the new order of 1919 made claims to universal, it offered certain rights to people everywhere in the world, the victorious powers who were really determining the peace had put the interests of particular states and particular people in mind. And this was really never clearer, oops, no, that is right, never clearer than when the founding powers of the League of Nations, so Britain, France, the United States, rejected the call of the Pan-African Congress, which met in Paris at the same time while the state delegates were in conference. The Pan-African Congress demanded that the members of the League of Nations take action to consider the rights of Black peoples. But there was no chance that the League was going to do that. The League of Nations was part of an attempt to establish rules and bureaucratic procedures on which stable and legitimate cooperation in the world would depend, but it was not intended to do away with balance of power politics. Power politics remained inherent to the League. Even after the United States left, it was the big powers, France, Britain, Italy, which dominated the organization in a variety of ways. So that's the kind of the power, the geopolitical top-down power dynamic of the League. At the same time, the League was part of a pioneering effort to engage civil society to promote a new type of foreign policy. One of its key conventions was that diplomacy should always proceed frankly and in full public view. So every treaty that was discussed, every discussion that was held inside the League, that was all published, records of it were published and available to the public. Robert Cecil, one of the principal architects of the League, really put a lot of faith in what he called the great weapon of public opinion. It was the League it was the public that would challenge what states were doing. The difficulty was translating that into reality. And there's a wonderful cartoon here by the British cartoonist David Lowe, who always presented the big powers of the world as predatory animals. So here the crocodiles, the tigers, the hyenas, the jackals, these are the statesmen of the world. The cartoon is from 1934, the point where the World Disarmament Conference hosted by the League of Nations fails, and the states are then saying to the general public, these poor sheep, the common people of the world, we haven't been able to control your warlike passions. We failed to deliver on disarmament because it's your fault. Of course, Lowe's, not so gently poking fun at that. The League of Nations was a League of Nation States. So while it had big ambitions about promoting cooperation and coordination, the powers also confined it to protect and promote their own interests. But they weren't in control of everything that happened. One of the ways that we think about the history of the League of Nations and the post-war order is by focusing on what the statesmen thought and said and did after 1919. I want to show in the time remaining how turbulence built the League instead. So it comes from the bottom up rather than from what statesmen argued at the time. I want to show how shocks and capacity really played an important role. And this was underscored by another key architect of the Covenant of the League of Nations, the South African Premier, Jan Christian Smuts in 1919, who'd just been elected, in his stress in conversation with John Maynard Keynes that we witnessed the collapse of the whole political and economic fabric of Central and Eastern Europe. Unemployment, starvation, anarchy, war, disease, despair stalk the land. And this was really demonstrated nowhere more than in the new nation state of Austria, the kind of rump that was left after the implosion of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which was the hungriest place in Europe in 1919 and 1920. It had been blockaded by the Allies for the whole of the First World War, and after 1918, it was now also blockaded by countries that had formerly been part of it, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, that were made up of peoples and territory that had been part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, now blockaded the country instead. So Austria became incredibly dependent on international aid that was provided by the United States, but also by the British government and the French government, but also by charities that sprung up almost overnight, and coalitions of people, including our own students here in Oxford, collected money alongside faculty members. They didn't just distribute food, they also distributed clothing and aid. So just to give you a bit of detail, this is a photograph from the University Archives in Vienna, where, colleagues here in Oxford helped to coordinate and distribute clothing to professors and faculty members at the University of Vienna. And it happened in other universities as well. So this is, the photograph quality, I'm afraid, is not great. Precisely because paper quality was poor and access to resources was so poor. In 1919, really the world was shocked and surprised at the terrible state that Austria found itself in. It captured the British imagination, particularly because Austro-Hungarian Empire was seen to be so developed, sophisticated, culturally significant in the 19th century that its fall from grace as an enemy and then into this kind of disintegrated Hungary mess was shocking. One of the first people to enter Austria at the end of the war in December 1918 was William Beveridge. It was his last job as permanent secretary of the Ministry of Food, and he wrote a very powerful report on the desperate plight of the Austrian people, feeling himself as ashamed before them. They are beggars, sans food, sans country, sans money, sans everything. And these are a couple of what he called grim photographs that were in his personal archives at the LSE. This, in some senses, provided an opportunity, a scientific opportunity, as well as a practical one. The British also sent in the Medical Research Council a group of women scientists, Harriet Chick, Elsie Dale, Margaret Hume, from the Lister Institute to study the impact of starvation and hunger on children's bodies. This wasn't just a kind of scientific project, it also had a profound humanitarian and political dimension. They were also active in the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, and vociferously argued alongside many other people that the international community needed to do something to aid Austria. And this was compounded, or was reinforced, by a very powerful campaign that was led by Dorothy Buxton and her sister Eglantine Jebb in 1919, that created the Save the Children Fund. These are campaigning photographs, I hope you can see on the screen, that actually landed Eglantine Jebb in prison. The photographs, very famous posters, show the images, the deformed images of starving Austrian children as part of their campaign to not just stop the blockade, but also to promote international coordination and cooperation to aid Austria, and really to expand the purpose of international relations and international organization. And this is really the kind of the core part of what I want to argue, is that international security, coordination and cooperation was built through turbulence as much as it was built by the great men sitting at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919 and 1920. And there were a variety of different shocks that radically changed what international coordination and cooperation should be about. The first was the impact of hunger. So I've talked about the Austrian case, but also disease, cholera, typhus, tuberculosis, and the Spanish influenza epidemic. That prompted the League of Nations to not just think about trying to prevent war and disarmament. It also led to the creation of the League of Nations Health Organization, a health committee that was dedicated to generating and sharing vaccine and intelligence about disease. The hyperinflation that gripped Austria, then Germany, Hungary, Poland, also generated a new determination for international coordination and cooperation that promoted an economic and financial agenda inside the League of Nations. This also wasn't planned in 1919. As to the population displacement that was a consequence of the war that was being waged in Russia, and that kind of extended towards Poland, and the consequence of the kind of imperial implosion that forced mass population displacement, and that created for the first time the notion of a refugee and the need for refugee protection and refugee rights. So here in this schema of the League of Nations, the turbulence, the shock generated an economic financial organization. I hope you can see here in the middle, a health organization. It also created Committee for Protection of Young People and Protection for Children and Young Persons. That was part of the Save the Children Fund's work. They created a charter of the rights of the child and so on. So turbulence, this kind of bottom-up threats to human security, was as important as top-down. Up with myself now because I've been talking to my slides and ignoring my notes. So this really built, turbulence built capacity as much as planning. But power was unevenly distributed in some senses. Whereas what I've suggested and spoken about is really the humanitarian side of the League of Nations work that was around human security. The other part of what it sought to do was stabilize international currencies. And without going into too many details, it's kind of having that, I mean, there was absolutely no planning for an economic and financial organization in the First World War at all. The idea was that, states would return to business as usual, that the free market could manage. The problem was that the currency implosion in Germany and Austria after 1918 meant that that just wasn't possible. And as hyperinflation gripped one country after the other, and governments couldn't coordinate an effort on their own, and neither could banks, the League of Nations was brought in to coordinate and stabilize the currencies of Germany and Hungary in the first instance, of Austria and Hungary, forgive me, in the first instance. The Austrian case is paradigmatic. It's the first country that's put under international oversight by an international organization, that is the League of Nations. And it's kind of done on the basis of the Austrian state mustn't spend money, the Austrian state must reduce food subsidies, the Austrian state must reduce pensions, the Austrian state must sack civil servants. And this has a big consequence for the way that the Austrians understand the meaning and purpose of international cooperation in ways that are very negative. After 1922, the League of Nations enables Austria to stabilize its currency. It facilitates a series of loans, and it has an international commissioner, Zimmermann, who supervises what the Austrian state is doing. But that experience of international oversight to promote financial stabilization and austerity, what we would call austerity now, means that the Austrians really then reject international cooperation and internationalism as the future of their state. It means that international coordination and cooperation has a very negative colonial, ironically, colonial inference in the way that they understand it. And it obliterates, and that's really what I want to get to in my final slide, it obliterates their understanding of the meaning of cooperation. So here on the right side, you have a poster of the American Relief Administration, Heute versorgt America, die österreichischen Kinder, that America is feeding and looking after, caring for Austrian children. And that sits in deep contrast with what the Austrians understand, or many Austrians understand, see the process of free markets in the way that Britain and the United States, to a lesser extent France, promotes them after 1919. So on the one hand, they have currency stabilization, but with it comes austerity. They also have the promotion of free trade, but free trade linked to individual nation states. And that's some of whom protect themselves. So it advantages the United States, it advantages Britain, but it breaks Europe up into, Central and Eastern Europe in particular, into tiny little sovereign states, which means that Austria can't access those markets. So that's really what this Austrian politician here at the end is saying. The byproduct of American-led process of national emancipation seems to be the commercial atomization of Central Europe. Austria had previously enjoyed access to a free market zone that was the whole of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It's no accident that the promoters of the European Economic Community, many of them come out of Austria, and now they feel that the treaty and the international organization is really skewed against them. So I think I'm up against time a little bit now. So let me just conclude with a few final remarks. Let me stress that, what was positive about the international system in the 1920s was that countries and critics like Austria, Germany, Italy, a bit of a critic, Japan, a critic, they still challenge and contest the international system through the mechanisms that the League of Nations and international law created after 1919. There was complaints, there was criticism, but it still worked within that international system. The danger for the international system comes in the 1930s when the Nazis abandon it altogether. So by rejecting and leaving the League of Nations in the 1930s, that's when, and turning their back on the League, that's the moment of greatest danger for the international organization. So that similar analogies might be made of the UN. So the danger doesn't come when the UN is ignored. The danger comes really when it is utterly rejected and a new system is essentially put in place. The Nazis were trying to build their own international organization that would really challenge them. In fact, they were worried that they were going to be invaded in Geneva as part of that Nazi plan. I also think this story reveals how financial, economic, environmental, and geopolitical security are all linked up. They can't be separated. We need to understand and think about their interactions and the different timelines that they work along. And I also, I suppose, want to stress that turbulence in our own times, can push individuals, institutions, and states to their absolute limits. But what I've also tried to show, albeit in a really squished form, is that it also fosters creative, pluralistic and dynamic advocacy. It's possible to generate out of turbulence new ideas and new modes of cooperation. The legacies of the League of Nations is what creates the UN system. It's what creates many regional organizations, and it has a lasting impact on international law. And I hope that this final thought might encourage us to remain purposeful, if not always optimistic, as we face turbulence in our own world, probably for some time to come. So thanks ever so much for your attention, and I look forward to the questions.
Patricia, thank you very much. It couldn't have been more topical, I have to say, and the importance of history helping with current challenges was really at the front of my mind listening to everything that you were saying. Can I ask people online to submit questions into the Q&A? We've got about 15 minutes or so. And please don't be bashful, because knowing Patricia, I'm sure she's happy to take any sorts of questions and observations.
I mean, I skipped through an awful lot of stuff. It's when you're talking to yourself in a room without an audience, it's quite hard to sort of know when to dwell and when not to.
Of course,
you know, it's so.
And I'm sure Ukraine is right at the front of our minds. And I won't ask my questions yet, but we've had a couple of questions in. Hookie Walker has asked a question about public opinion. Does Professor Clavin agree that the spread of radio, television, and so-called social media has made the conduct of international relations a great deal more complex?
Yes, I mean, I think it's one of the things that's very challenging for us, is that we feel we have lots more information. I mean, this sense of information overload, they also experienced in the 1920s and 30s, because the speed with which the telegram operated, they had newspapers, you know, many editions in a day. I think what surprises me about the difference between the early 20th century and the early 21st centuries is that the element of social media and actually the degree of specialism. So now it's even more possible than it was in the 1920s to find people who already reflect your own mindset. I think it was much less possible in the 1920s to ignore other opinion in the same way that it is possible now, because we just have so much choice. So the kind of need to engage with and think about people's views other than your own is an important dynamic that I don't think we do, oddly, as much in the 21st century as they did in the 1920s and the 1930s.
Really interesting, thank you. And a question from Herman Svart. What lessons can we draw to reflect on the potential consequences of American rhetoric in recent years, questioning in particular their continued participation in NATO, which again is very timely? And before you answer, can we have some more questions, please? But to Herman's question about rhetoric from the US and NATO, Patricia.
Yes, I mean, this is a very interesting and quite frightening, you know, speaking from the Europeans, quite frightening element. I think lessons of the past is obviously the people that I've studied, so the first half of the 20th century, many of the people who experienced the project of building a world order after the First World War were around to have another go in 1945. It's a very young generation of people that come out of the First World War that are recruited into building an international order and drafting international law. So some of these people are sort of still in international relations in the 1960s and the 1970s. So they themselves were especially preoccupied with the importance of America's role. I mean, I didn't really talk about it very much, but the United States as the key hegemonic power financially in 1919, and then, you know, abandoning the League, abandoning Europe, and then having to return in 1930. Well, you know, Chamberlain trying to persuade Roosevelt back in, and then finally with Pearl Harbor, the question being resolved. And that then being the core lesson that was taken from the 30s was, once we got to the end of the Second World War, to bind America to European security, and the Cold War resolved any questions in the United States about whether that was in America's interest. So that story is always told on the fact that Britain in the 19th century was the hegemonic power and kept the world safe, you know, the world's policeman. And that was the role of the United States. So one of the dangers of that logic, so there's kind of two parts to my answer to Herman Svart's question. The danger of that logic is that it takes you in the 21st century to thinking, well, you know, is it now the time of China? You know, is this China's moment? 19th century, British century, 20th century, American century, 21st century, China century. Certainly in the United States, a big preoccupation amongst historians and definitely international relations scholars, people who work in international security. When is it that China might go to war to take Taiwan? When will China roam, in the same way that the United States moment starts with the Philippines and, you know, pushes on from there. So so that's a lesson I'm less keen on, in a way, because it has this very dangerous element about anticipating all with China, and China also thinking that way too, rather than thinking, you know, there was a paper I read recently where it was suggested that actually, rather than China thinking it had a lot of time because it was still growing, the last 18 months have actually made China question how much time has it got? Maybe now time is running out for it to make that big move to take Taiwan, to assert its power. I would probably rather stress the importance of multilateral cooperation. So in the 20th century, sorry, this is quite a long answer. In the 20th century, what the US did was no more determinant than, you know, it couldn't decide or determine everything. It was multilateral cooperation, or the failure of multilateralism, that brought war or helped stabilize international relations. So I think that, you know, in terms of US rhetoric and questioning its participation in NATO, I would say, you know, Europe certainly needs America in. It's not, you know, Germany's not ready. Britain's situation is also complicated. So, you know, for NATO to function as the major military force that it is, American resources are key. For the Americans, I would say, and I hope that they, you know, that they take this on board, that really international relations is about multilateralism. It's not just a multiple arenas. It's not just about the Pacific. It wasn't just about the Atlantic, you know, in the Second World War, and that NATO should be part of its global thinking and global organization. So sorry, that's a long answer.
No, really, really helpful. We've got some really good questions coming in, and I'm going to jump around and try and gather some of them together. But the question that I had, and I'm sure was at the front of everyone's minds, was Ukraine. And Usario de Zoom is asking about your view as to the outcome of the war, but also there are questions about Putin in particular, and how one deals with pariahs like Putin. An issue relating to grain export as well, which goes to your point about food. But can I gather those all together and pick up the question about what do you think is going to happen? But you talked about purposefulness rather than optimism. How do you deal with those things, and what do you think is going to happen in the light of not just thuggery and threats, but the real risk of nuclear power in an age when social media notwithstanding, the great efforts that are being made by Zelensky, are not really driving change in relation to Russia and Russia's supporters.
Yes, I mean, I'm not a Russian expert. So, in that sense, I think, I mean, the people that I've spoken to, probably like you in Oxford, that there are people who are experts in this area, and they don't have any better answers than the one I'm going to give you. I mean, I suspect, there was an ongoing war there for 5 years before it was a major, the complete sort of instrument of state policy. War as an instrument of state policy moment where it was invasion. It looks now like more resources going in. I think it's probably going to be protracted. I suspect there are lots of, well, I think there are some off the record discussions going on. I think what's hard to know is quite how about Putin's situation and about the political dynamics around that. That makes it much more difficult. From the perspective of the 1930s, I don't think it's helpful to describe things as appeasement, to be honest, because it means you tend not to think through the issues that are at stake, and it's important to do that. If I can pick it up on that question about the grain export agreement by Russia and Ukraine, I think that is really key. It shows it shows that neither side thinks they can win the war outright, that they're prepared to, in a way, negotiate while waging war. That is a positive sign. It's also fundamentally recognizes two things. One is the inequality in the distribution of food and the central importance of Ukraine as a food exporter, as an exporter of fertilizer in the kind of global food system, and the importance of that region. So I do take that as a positive sign. But I certainly don't think pariahs like Putin should be allowed to negotiate the kind of peace through China and Turkey that they're looking for. I think that's, while I believe in negotiation, I don't think that poses a fundamental challenge to the global order, which is what he's also seeking to make. But, I think, like probably all of us, I'm hoping for a swift outcome, but I don't see one really.
Going back to the League of Nations, Jeremy Parsons is asking about positive features from the League of Nations that have been lost or forgotten.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, because it's, what I think is really positive about it is actually its multi-purpose quality, which I kind of halfway through my talk, I thought I should have got to this bit much sooner. But it really, because it was one organization rather than multiple organizations, in fact, you could connect some of these questions up. It's why, in a way, Neville Kirk-Smith's question about the grain is critical, really, because for the League also, food is a way of accessing and illustrating and moving on complicated problems. As they were able to connect issues up in a way that now we tend to separate governance. So there are people that will know about food, there are people that will know about trade law, there are people that will know about armaments, and they're very siloed topics, very siloed forms of thinking about what security is. And actually what we need to be able to do is understand how they connect across. So some of the problems around food and energy and capital and weapons are all being considered separately, but you could see how in the moment the war began, they were all actually really interconnected. And that's, it's part of the challenge for somebody asked about, UN reform. It's as much a question for EU reform.
And just on that question of reform, but also the equality of the players, to Ace Odman's question about the veto power of the 5 Security Council members. Was there anything akin to that in the League of Nations? And
no. No, so this is really the council. So there wasn't a separate security, there was a council. It was much larger. So I think this is one of the positive features that, one might look at again. It was much more dynamic, but this was, I think in a way, one of the contradictions of our expectations of what certainly the UN, that part of the UN organization can deliver, because it's really about promoting power political interests. It's not about, it seems to be about challenging them. So I certainly think the Security Council, I mean, it's been paralyzed since 1945, really, and every so often it's looked like there would be a moment, as in 1990, where suddenly Russia could be more active, because the Cold War was over, and China has always been there from the beginning, but because of the prehistory, China was admitted as a member before it was the People's Republic of China. It was admitted as the nationalist government. So, something there has got to change, I think, because it is, otherwise I fear it will be sidelined. It looks anachronistic from the French and British perspective, really.
I know some people will leave us at 6, but there are a few more questions that I'm keen just to pick up, Patricia, if I may. And the last question, I think, leads nicely into Christopher McCall's question about the liberal economic orthodoxy of Keynes. And the question from Christopher relates to your view as to whether or not neoliberalism is a key factor today in today's turbulence. What would you say?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Yeah, I mean, it was a big factor in the 2008 turbulence, and we've not really dealt with all of the kind of reforms that were proposed were not carried out. And I think that, it kind of points to, I mean, I read Keynes a lot with my students. I read Keynes. Keynes is sort of everywhere in this period.
Yeah.
And, he wouldn't, I mean, his version of liberalism is not what the neoliberals give us later. It's much, much more radical than the kind of, his critique of the kind of, classical liberalism in the 1920s and 30s. But I suppose the kind of another key thing that Christopher's pointing to is the separation of the public and the private, that what markets do is seen to be separate from what states do. But clearly, market turbulence, market behaviors have profound consequences for us. And of course, things like food are almost entirely in the private domain. States have got almost no power and no oversight. I mean, that was really obvious in this country in the COVID pandemic, where suddenly, and actually supermarkets were tremendously well organized. You did think maybe Sainsbury's should be running the government rather than the government. But, so I think this kind of boundaries about where the state is and what's public and what's private are really at issue here in these moments of turbulence, partly the opportunity to push things in new directions.
Great, thank you. Then there's a question from Ben Brown about the invasion of Iraq, and another one from Rosario about African nations. Can we do a step back and just think about other players? We've talked about the UK, US, and China, but I'm certainly interested in the Middle East and Africa, and maybe we should go wider afield to Latin America. But I think it's very easy to neglect those parts.
Absolutely. And in fact, I think, Ben, I mean, both of those questions from Rosario and Ben Brown really point to kind of critical moments for the UN. It's actually, Ben's right, in a way, the kind of human security report that I talked about was precisely to try and reassert the value of the UN and the global South in the wake of the war in Iraq, because its authority was profoundly undermined by the way that the powers that decided to go to war ultimately circumvented UN law and UN institutions. And so the human security agenda was a way of saying, actually, global inequality, poverty, disease, resource questions, this is where climate change, this is where we have a kind of planetary vision. And in fact, the League of Nations issues a very similar report called Positive Security in the 1930s. That's actually where I sort of had this horrible moment of, I've read this before when I read the human, and so that's, so Yuzario's question about, that's the Chinese have understood that, that is what their investment. So it's certainly, and that's in a way the danger of the war in Ukraine is that's what I was trying to get at in my kind of slightly awkward two-part introduction, is this kind of stress on geopolitics, on thinking, actually, is this a new Cold War? Is the danger that we miss these concerns and we miss the global South world because it refocuses us back, it forces, well, it doesn't force us, there's a risk that you just kind of fall back into that tram line of thinking the way or understanding international relations as they did in the 1970s or 1980s. And of course, for some elements of global institutions, it's actually the ideas and practices of these parts of the world that are really important. So quite a lot of what we think about in epidemic and world health, that comes from Pan-American cooperation, from Brazil and so on, in the 19th century. So there, and the same is true, of African voices around food security and food law. So, you're absolutely right, David, to stress that. And that's partly, I think, what's so difficult about this moment where actually turbulence is coming from these different forces. And it's also something I didn't really talk about, running on very different timelines. So, the financial crisis of 2008, actually that, impacted for several years at the same time as currency turbulence can happen very quickly. A food crisis or, environmental crisis, they're all running along different timelines, and that makes it even more difficult to try and orientate and think about what a solution or solutions should look like.
Excellent, thank you. You have an offer from Stephen Stanley Little in relation to his father's memoirs and diaries, which I'll leave you to respond to. As to whether or not you've been
Excellent. I would, yes, please. It is that, I have a couple of scrapbooks of people that were members of the League of Nations Unions. It really captures how for this generation, international coordination, debates about international relations was central to being a young person in the 1920s and 30s. And in a way, that goes back to that very first question that you asked me, David, well, in the chat, someone else asked me that you relayed about media and about the world that we live in with information is actually, our students think they're connected up, but I'm really not sure they know anything like the kind of, the sort of the global world and its composition in the way that they would have done in the 20s and 30s.
And the final question from me, Patricia, which notwithstanding what I take to be your quite optimistic presentation about the potential for international cooperation, whatever the drivers, just to ask a very UK focused question about Brexit, because we now talk about Brexit Britain, which doesn't inherently rule out international cooperation, but it does actually send a very strong message to our EU neighbours about how we want to proceed on our own. And I just wondered, are there any historical parallels that might make me feel a bit more optimistic about the decision that the UK referendum produced?
No, well, when it happened, I kept thinking about poor old Austria that was kind of blockaded by then blockaded by its former friends. Well, only that, it's difficult because of the signal. But the reality of making international relations work is that you need to sign agreements. Eventually, you need to sign agreements. Eventually, economic logic starts to bite. I speak as somebody who's written quite a lot on trade law. So, and studied, takes years and years and years to negotiate a trade deal. So I do think that in that sense, for the British government, things around Ukraine and NATO are important, and that you can see the comfort with which certain individuals are happy. That's kind of Britain's classic role. I think that where the challenge lies is really finding a coherent economic and social vision, and a different type of language. It's very difficult because it's not, for a historian of British foreign policy, this has not been a Britain I recognise, because Britain historically, it's got its difficult legacies, but as a force in diplomacy, its kind of intelligence and its skill really is quite quite powerful compared to some of the other states I've studied. So yeah, it's harder to be, I think I'm kind of optimistic in the sense that eventually I kind of feel like there's a kind of logic that will, but yeah, it's difficult.
Yeah, I think we have to be optimistic, don't we? So,
yeah, we do.
But Patricia, thank you so much. It's been a really fascinating, stimulating and thought-provoking lecture, really touching on so many of the themes that I set out at the beginning that we all struggle with today. On behalf of everybody online, can I thank you very much? Can I thank old members for joining us today? Thank you for your really interesting and thought-provoking questions. I am keen to tell you that our next lecture is on the 23rd of February. It's Professor David Steinsaltz from Worcester, who's talking about the fascinating subject of aging, which obviously impacts us all. But I know that will be really interesting. Please do join us. But just in conclusion, I was keen to say a big thank you to all of our old members. What struck me since I've taken on the role of Provost is how you feel a very strong affinity wherever you are in the world with Worcester and the Worcester community, and today's discussion evidences that. Thank you all that you do for the college. I look forward to welcoming you back to Oxford if you are able to travel, and Patricia and I will welcome you, and I hope you have a very good day, afternoon or evening, whichever applies best to you. And once again, please do drop me a line, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you.